over the last few years, you'll have felt this momentum or groundswell around the idea of posting salary requirements or salary numbers on job postings. And typically it's been driven a lot by the candidate side. But you're starting to see a little bit more conversation, of course, across the board where hiring managers are feeling that they also want to be able to differentiate candidates and just make the hiring process easier by being a little bit more transparent about salary requirements on job listings. Now, here's a story that's indicating that in May or in the spring, New York City is going to be mandating that employers greater than 4 employees in size are going to have to start putting salary requirements on their job listings. There are a couple industries or a couple kinds of companies that are going to be exempted for this. I think staffing companies are one. But in general, people are going to have to start showing a reasonable range within which the compensation is for the role that they're listing for or putting the advertisement out for. And this is interesting because New York City is so economically powerful. Colorado already has this in place. And in conversations that I've had with executive search contacts that I have, a lot has been adapted to account for this change in Colorado, and so that's meant changes on websites, changes on different things to make sure that companies are following through with this requirement. New York City, on the other hand, I think is for context, a top 20 global economy. If you look at city against country GDP, I mean it's just under, I think, Canada and Spain in terms of their GDP size, just as a city. And so you've got a lot of economic clout when we talk about a city like this. And with that amount of clout, of course, you've got the frictions of implementing a solution like this or a tactic like this. You've got employer groups, of course, that are pushing to see this delayed at the very least and then eradicated at the most, because it's difficult on many different levels as an employer to be able to do this. One, you've got to be very sure about the salary range that you're shooting for. A lot of the times, especially smaller companies, the kind of role that you need, the job that needs to be done, but it's difficult to project out, okay, well, who are we going to be able to attract? And are we going to be able to match up? There's elasticity in what companies are willing to pay depending on the level of talent that they're able to bring in. And so now companies are going to have to lock into a certain pay range and know beforehand, all right, well, this is the caliber of talent that we want for this role. And then they're going to have to dedicate themselves to finding that thing. So there's the pros and the cons to that side of the equation. There's also the side where companies are going to have to think about their employer brand too. There's a very strong employer brand element to this. Companies will have to know what their value proposition is up front, which is something that we recommend anyway at Daggerfinn. I mean, knowing who you are as an employer and then what it is that you bring to the market is one of the quickest, easiest ways to differentiate yourself in a very saturated market. And New York City is one of those very saturated markets. There's a lot of every different kind of company there. And but knowing then that, okay, the salary range that we put out there is basically the first level of employer branding that we're putting out there too. If you see yourself as a company that's maybe high growth but lower on the base salary, but the potential upside is larger because of equity or something like that, you're going to have to realize that you're going to have to do a stronger job of making that clear up front, because if people are attaching themselves to when they're going through the internet, so to speak, and seeing job name, company name, and then salary range, which is typically the three eye-catching things to a job seeker, I'd say, it's going to become very difficult to control your employer brand if you're not able to showcase different levels of what you bring to the table. This is going to be great, I think, for the larger companies that have the brand recognition already and are able to very clearly delineate what it is that they need from the marketplace, the kind of role that they need, and then the kind of candidate flow I can imagine them getting as this comes through and people start to see, oh, that's how much I can make doing that. I'm going to apply to that too. So it definitely opens up the candidate pool to some companies and some brands. But what it does is it makes it difficult, I think, for other companies, especially smaller companies, I'd say, to compete because it requires a level of transparency, sophistication, and just knowing things that smaller companies maybe haven't had the time to worry about. They're busy with the operations. They're busy trying to grow their company. And they're not thinking about what are these salary bands that we have to fit everybody into. And instead they're maybe basing compensation on tenure and how good the work somebody is doing and different things like that. So it brings up a lot of interesting questions, and it's very interesting. As I mentioned earlier, Colorado already has this in place. So we've already got kind of the A test. But New York City is such an economic powerhouse globally that we'll see how this plays out, whether it actually gets implemented in May, whether it gets pushed off. And if it does get implemented in an economy as large as New York City, what does this mean globally? What are the ramifications for other economies of scale? And that's going to be very interesting to find out over time.